Chapter 8. Reaching Out to Our Fourth Refuge. While no substantive progress was made with China, the facts on the ground in Tibet were now beginning to change in a worrying direction. On the one hand, it is true that Tibet had opened up to some extent, and that things were better compared to the period of the Cultural Revolution. On the other, contrary to Hu Yaobang's pledge to reduce the number of Chinese officials and cadres, a massive Chinese migration into Tibet had begun in the name of development. This was profoundly concerning because if left unchecked, it would fundamentally alter the demographics of the region, turning the Tibetan plateau into just another Chinese province, with Tibetans marginalized in their own homeland. The historical evidence of what China had done in the regions of other nationalities was clearly a source of deep anxiety. From a socio-cultural point of view, this influx of Chinese in Tibet could signal the beginning of a process that had the potential to change the very character of places dear to us Tibetans, including especially the holy city of Lhasa. At the same time, politically speaking, the picture coming out of Tibet was getting confusing, to say the least. Under the party leadership of Wu Jinghua in Tibet, there seemed to be a newly liberal policy toward religious practice, exemplified, for example, by the permission given for the revival of the Great Prayer Festival in Lhasa in February 1986, for the first time since 1967. Yet from the senior Beijing leadership side, there seemed to be nothing but intransigence. We needed to reassess our strategy. We made the decision to make our proposals more systematic and present them at international forums. Our discussions with Beijing left us no choice but to use some international stage to make our proposals. This strategy also allowed us to offer our supporters across the world, who had been patiently waiting to hear the results of our discussions, an opportunity to learn about what our deeper aspirations were. I often describe the international community as our fourth refuge, in addition to the traditional Buddhist refuge of the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha community. Some of our efforts had an effect. In July 1985, 91 members of the United States Congress signed a letter addressed to the President of the People's Republic of China. The letter expressed support for direct talks and urged the Chinese to grant the very reasonable and justified aspirations of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his people every consideration. The Chinese, concerned about the growing international attention to Tibet, invited the former US President Jimmy Carter to visit Lhasa in June 1987, followed by the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl in July of that same year. In June 1987, the House of Representatives in the United States adopted a bill condemning human rights abuses in Tibet and urged China to establish a constructive dialogue. On September 21st of that year, the United States Congressional Human Rights Caucus invited me to address them. I opened with the following: "The world is increasingly interdependent, so that lasting peace, national, regional, and global, can only be achieved if we think in terms of broader interest rather than parochial needs. At this time, it is crucial that all of us, the strong and the weak, contribute in our own way. I speak to you today as the leader of the Tibetan people and as a Buddhist monk devoted to the principles of a religion based on love and compassion." Then I proceeded to lay out a 5-point peace plan as the basis for a potential negotiation with China. They were: first, transformation of the whole of Tibet into a zone of peace, demilitarized so that there could be a buffer between the armies of Asia's two most populous countries, India and China. 2. Abandonment of China's population transfer policy, which threatens the very existence of the Tibetans as a people. 3. Respect for the Tibetan people's fundamental human rights and democratic freedoms. 4. Restoration and protection of Tibet's natural environment and the abandonment of China's use of Tibet for the production of nuclear weapons and dumping of nuclear waste. 5. Commencement of earnest negotiations on the future status of Tibet and of relations between the Tibetan and Chinese peoples. Shortly after, in October, the United States Senate passed the congressional bill that had previously been adopted by the House of Representatives, and in December of that year, President Reagan signed into law the Foreign Relations Authorization Act, which declared that the United States would take the treatment of the Tibetan people into account in its relations with the People's Republic of China, encouraging the Chinese government to respect human rights in Tibet, to reciprocate the Dalai Lama's efforts in establishing a constructive dialogue and calling for the release of political prisoners. The Chinese state media strongly criticized the 5-point peace plan. This criticism, especially of me personally, deeply hurt many Tibetans. Less than a week after my speech in Washington, on September 27th, monks from Drepung Monastery protested, carrying a Tibetan national flag and calling for independence. They were arrested. When I heard about the news, I was deeply concerned. Then, on October 1st, monks from Sera Monastery staged a second demonstration, joined by large crowds demanding the prisoners' release, and a major disturbance began. The police station was burned down, and Chinese police opened fire, killing several people. This was followed by a further protest on October 6th. After a lull on the last day of the Great Prayer Festival on March 5th, 1988, another protest erupted by the monks from Ganden Monastery. This led to spontaneous protests across the country, and martial law was imposed on March 8th, 1988 in Lhasa. All this amply demonstrated that the aspirations of the Tibetan people inside Tibet went way beyond mere economic improvement, not to mention a profound discontent. In the meantime, as I had been invited to address the European Parliament in mid-June, I wanted to take this opportunity to formally elaborate on the 5-point peace plan. To prepare, I convened a special meeting in Dharamsala to discuss the key points of what I was planning to present in Strasbourg for 3 days, June 6th to 9th, presided by my Kashag Aunt's cabinet and attended by the members of the Assembly of Tibetan People's Deputies, public servants, NGOs, selected newly arrived Tibetans, as well as special invitees and others representing Tibetan communities in diaspora. I discussed at length the key points of my proposal. Following this in-depth discussion, as well as debates, the participants of this special meeting unanimously endorsed the proposal. On June 15th, 1988, I addressed the European Parliament in Strasbourg, including these key additional points. The whole of Tibet, known as Cholka Sum, Utsang, Kham, and Amdo, should become a self-governing democratic political entity founded on law by agreement of the people for the common good and the protection of themselves and their environment, in association with the People's Republic of China. The government of the People's Republic of China could remain responsible for Tibet's foreign policy. The government of Tibet should, however, develop and maintain relations through its own Foreign Affairs Bureau in the field of commerce, education, culture, religion, tourism, science, sports, and other non-political activities. Tibet should join international organizations concerned with such activities. The government of Tibet should be founded on a constitution or basic law. The basic law should provide for a democratic system of government entrusted with the task of ensuring economic equality, social justice, and protection of the environment. This means that the government of Tibet will have the rights to decide on all affairs relating to Tibet and the Tibetans. We were effectively stating that we were not going to seek independence. We were expressing our willingness to remain part of the People's Republic of China, but only with a guarantee of genuine autonomy. This position I later came to call the middle way approach, a middle way between independence and the present reality that was threatening the survival of the Tibetan people and culture. In essence, what I was offering to Beijing leadership was this. Since, with the invasion of 1950 and the subsequent signing of the 17-point agreement, Communist China had chosen to force Tibet into a union with the People's Republic of China, I was proposing that we work together with sincerity and dedication on both sides to make this union truly viable. I was trying to find a way for both sides to make the Tibetans feel truly at home within the family of the People's Republic of China. I was not seeking to turn back the historical clock somehow. I was looking to the future based on a hard-nosed awareness of the present reality of Tibet, forcibly occupied by China. At the same time, I was seriously taking into account Beijing's key concern, namely territorial integrity and stability. My proposal was aimed at mutual benefit and seeking a mutually agreeable solution. Sadly, Beijing chose not to appreciate the historic significance of what we were offering. I do not think this is due to their failure to grasp what was being offered. My own sense is that it is simply due to the lack of political will on the part of the Chinese leadership to seriously address the issue of Tibet. I still remain convinced that given political will and vision on the part of the Chinese leadership, it would not be that difficult for China to satisfy the needs of the Tibetans. I admitted that when I first presented it, many Tibetans, both inside Tibet and in exile, would be disappointed by the moderate stance the Strasbourg proposal represented. But I insisted that the thoughts outlined in my Strasbourg speech represented the most realistic means by which to re-establish Tibet's separate identity and restore the fundamental rights of the Tibetan people while accommodating China's own interests. I also stated that it was my wish not to take any active part in any future government of Tibet, but would continue to work as much as needed for the well-being and happiness of the Tibetan people. In fact, the core of what was presented in the Strasbourg proposal had already been shared with the Chinese leadership through my exploratory delegation who met their Chinese counterparts. In Strasbourg, we were bringing these ideas to wider international attention. After my speech at Strasbourg, I visited Switzerland and met with a large gathering of Tibetans there, and I took the opportunity to share my thinking. I knew the moderate stance outlined in the Strasbourg proposal entailed ceasing our advocacy for full independence, which could cause unhappiness among many Tibetans. I stressed at this gathering of Tibetans that the essence of what we aspired to, the ability to protect our language, culture, religion, and our identity as a people, could be achieved within the framework of the People's Republic of China. I also pointed out that, given Tibet's status as a landlocked country, from the economic development perspective, we Tibetans might actually stand to gain by such an arrangement. I also stated that, in the end, it is the Tibetan people who will have to decide their own destiny. While I understand people's emotional attachment to ideas of sovereignty and independence, personally, I have always been more of a pragmatist. I am a huge admirer of the ideals behind the European Union. Today, nations like France and Germany, which traditionally saw each other as enemies, join together and cede part of their cherished sovereignty to a collective European body, so that the citizens within the individual countries have a greater chance of flourishing. It is a historical fact that sometimes, due to geopolitical conditions, what were previously independent nations come together to form a composite entity. Yet at other times, again because of changed political situations, some nations newly obtain their freedom, such as Timor-Leste. For me at least, what matters is the presence of an adequate structure and framework that ensures the continued survival and thriving of a people with their unique language, culture, and identity. In the immediate aftermath of my Strasbourg proposal, not only was there disappointment among some Tibetans, there were in fact some sharp criticisms of this stance. For example, my own eldest brother, Taktsa Rinpoche, sent a letter to prominent Tibetans in the diaspora criticizing the decision to relinquish the demand for Tibetan independence. He went so far as to characterize our proposal as a sellout. At the same time, the reaction from key Tibetan figures inside Tibet and China was encouraging. In the words of Phuntsok Wangyal, the Tibetan communist, who was my official translator during my visit to Beijing in 1954 to 1955, the Dalai Lama's middle way approach of seeking only a meaningful autonomy for Tibet rather than independence in the present historical context is an expression of the great responsibility he takes in giving serious thought over the fundamental issues. Similarly, another prominent Tibetan scholar inside Tibet stated that because the middle way approach was mutually beneficial to both Tibetans and Chinese, it was the only way to resolve the issue of Tibet once and for all. Let me pause here to address an important question. Sometimes Chinese authorities criticize me for allowing Tibetans inside as well as outside to speak about Tibetan independence. This criticism is premised on the strange idea that somehow I must or should have the power to ban any Tibetan from even mentioning the phrase Tibetan independence. It's one thing for an authoritarian regime to ban free speech and use force when it deems someone has violated the ban. It is something else when it comes to a free and open society, such as the Tibetan community in exile. One of the defining marks of a democratic system is freedom of expression. Even though I disagree with those Tibetans who argue that advocating for Tibetan independence is the best way forward for our freedom struggle, I have the greatest respect for these people. The Tibetan Youth Congress, for example, has as part of its mission to struggle for the total independence of Tibet. My own aim, however, has been to ensure that the formal leadership of the Tibetan movement, as well as the majority of Tibetans living in the free world, are convinced of the correctness of our middle way approach, seeking a genuine autonomy rather than separation from the People's Republic of China. Despite my explicit public announcement that we were not seeking independence, when the Chinese embassy in New Delhi issued a formal response on September 23, 1988, they stated, "The new proposal put forward by the Dalai Lama in Strasbourg cannot be considered as the basis for talks with the central government because it has not at all relinquished the concept of the independence of Tibet." Nonetheless, Beijing did accept our suggestion to engage in a series of talks to start in Geneva in January 1989. In the end, though, Chinese officials put forward a number of pretexts for not starting the talks. One of the reasons, it seemed, was they were upset that we had made public the composition of our team, as well as the venue of the talks. We had even proposed that a pre-meeting be held in Hong Kong in April to resolve any issues and concerns they may have had in mind, but to no avail. It is possible that further demonstrations in Lhasa in December 1988, in commemoration of International Human Rights Day, might have been another reason why the meeting did not take place. On January 28, 1989, the Panchen Lama died suddenly at his monastic base of Tashi Lunpo. We mourned his death with a heavy heart, recognizing that we had lost a heroic Tibetan leader who had suffered much on behalf of his people. While he was alive, I felt that his efforts inside Tibet, especially on the front of the protection of Tibetan language, culture, and identity, and my own efforts to be a free spokesperson for the Tibetans in the outside world, really complemented each other well. So his sudden death deeply saddened me, with the acute awareness that I had lost a truly powerful and courageous ally on the ground inside Tibet. We held memorial prayers for the Panchen Lama at the Thekchen Chuling Temple in Dharamsala, and similar religious ceremonies in many monasteries, including especially at Tashi Lunpo, the Panchen Lama's traditional monastery re-established in southern India. As is the custom, I composed a prayer for his quick return, Nyurajon Söldeb, consisting of 9 verses which contained the following lines. Even under a canopy of dense clouds of constant threat, with no control and freedom at all, you shouldered the great burden of Buddha's doctrine and being's welfare. Alas, sad indeed is your sudden departure into peace. In accord with your aspiration cultivated for so long, may the new moon of your unmistaken reincarnation shine from the eastern snowy peaks of the good fortune of the people of the land of snows. May we soon find the joy to cherish this resplendent new moon. The Buddhist Association of China, obviously acting with full knowledge of the government, invited me to participate in his memorial service. We took this invitation with great seriousness. However, Beijing had just cancelled the planned Geneva talks. The relatively moderate party leader in Tibet, Wu Jinghua, had been dismissed at the end of 1988, and the invitation was only to Beijing rather than to Tibet. There was no clarity on whether I would be able to meet any of the senior Chinese leaders or any important Tibetan figures. With much uncertainty and no adequate time to evaluate carefully the implications, in the end we made the decision that I would not go. Afterward, events rapidly went out of control. On March 5th, 1989, in the run-up to the anniversary of March 10th, the largest demonstration against the communist Chinese rule since the Lhasa uprising of 1959 broke out. For 3 days, the Chinese police cracked down viciously on the Tibetan people, leaving several hundred dead. On March 8th, the Chinese imposed martial law in Lhasa. The issue of Tibet was now being raised also in the parliaments of many European countries, with the first international hearing on human rights abuses in Tibet organized in Germany in that same year. On April 15th of that year, Hu Yaobang, who had been dismissed from the party leadership in 1987, died. A series of student-led protests began from that day, continuing to June 4th in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The students called for greater accountability, democracy, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech. At their height, more than 1 million people assembled, constituting the most significant challenge to the Chinese Communist Party since it rose to power. Like the rest of the world, I was transfixed by these events, following them with a mixture of admiration, anxiety, and hope. On May 14th, I stated, "I am watching with great interest the current movement in China for democracy and freedom. The Chinese people, particularly the youth and the intellectuals, are trying to convey their real feelings. I support their movements and admire their courage. These developments will benefit China." It seems that at least a section of the leadership of China is trying to adopt a more positive approach to these developments in spite of tremendous pressure from within the system. I urge upon the Chinese leadership to have the courage to accept the reality and comprehend the aspirations of their people. On May 20th, martial law was declared in Beijing, and some 300,000 troops mobilized in the city. As tension was building and the dramatic events were unfolding across the world's televisions, I felt that I must express my solidarity with the protesting students and their aspirations. Many within my circle advised me not to do so, for it could offend Beijing, with whom we were, after all, trying to negotiate. On June 3rd, 1989, as we all know, the Chinese leadership unleashed the People's Liberation Army on its own people using live ammunition. On the 4th, they sent armored personnel carriers and tanks into Tiananmen Square. To this day, we do not know how many were killed. I was shocked. The sight of the Chinese army killing its own people simply because they were asking for more freedom and a better life was horrifying. I called my secretary, Tenzin Gaiche Tethong, and Lodi Gyari, then in charge of information and international relations, to come to see me at once. I asked them to work on a statement expressing strong opposition to the Chinese government's crackdown and my solidarity with the young Chinese people gathered in Tiananmen Square. They were understandably concerned that such a public statement from me would negatively impact our ongoing discussion with the Chinese leadership. But I said that if I did not speak out now, what moral right would I ever have to speak for freedom and democracy? I reminded them that those young Chinese in the square were asking for nothing more than greater freedom. There are moments in time, especially in which fundamental issues of humanity are concerned, when one cannot remain silent out of expediency or self-interest. So I issued a statement expressing my opposition in the strongest terms against the military actions of the Chinese leadership. I expressed my deep disappointment at the Chinese government's failure to appreciate the true feelings of its people. And mourning the loss of so many innocent lives, I said how I shared in the sorrow of those families, relatives and friends who had lost their loved ones. I can say with confidence that on that day of June 4th, 1989, Tibetans everywhere, both inside Tibet as well as outside it, stood in solidarity with the Chinese people. Later, when I formally accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo on December 10th, 1989, I began by saying, I accept the prize with profound gratitude on behalf of the oppressed everywhere and for all those who struggle for freedom and work for world peace. I accept it as a tribute to the man who founded the modern tradition of non-violent action for change, Mahatma Gandhi, whose life taught and inspired me. Since I felt it was essential to include a statement about the events of Tiananmen Square in my acceptance speech, I said, "In China, the popular movement for democracy was crushed by brutal force in June this year. But I do not believe the demonstrations were in vain, because the spirit of freedom was rekindled among the Chinese people, and China cannot escape the impact of this spirit of freedom sweeping many parts of the world." The brave students and their supporters showed the Chinese leadership and the world the human face of that great nation. While popular movements for freedom in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe succeeded, bringing down the Berlin Wall and freeing so many from communist totalitarianism, the student-led freedom movement in Tiananmen did not succeed in bringing down communist China's bamboo curtain. Needless to say, historians and geopolitical experts will seek to understand fully what might explain this contrast. At the risk of sounding simplistic, two things come to mind. One is that communist China's People's Liberation Army, despite its name, was willing to shoot its own people, which was not the case with Eastern Europe. Second, in Eastern Europe, when the challenge to power came in the form of popular movements for freedom, the momentum had the backing of pretty much the entire population. In the case of Tiananmen Square, even though protests supporting the student-led movement did spread to several hundred towns and cities in China, it did not seem to have reached a critical mass that could have made a real difference. But I do not believe, even for a second, that Tiananmen Square marks the end of the Chinese people's quest for greater freedom, dignity, and democracy. It is not surprising that Tiananmen Square, though not related directly to Tibet, had a significant impact on our attempts to come to a negotiation with the Chinese. The process that had begun in 1979 with Deng Xiaoping's statement to my brother Gyalo Thondup that apart from independence, everything could be discussed, had come to an end. Deng's leadership, which had promised so much, in the end proved capable of as much brutality as that of Mao's. Martial law was imposed in Lhasa on March 8, 1989, and was only lifted on May 1st of the following year.